You're about to hear how Tony, this episode's guest, made a career change from tax after working in it for 9 years and disliking it pretty much the entire time. He shares his advice on how to make a career change properly and examples of roles that could be a good fit for people with tax experience. His advice and tips, however, are applicable if you want to stay in tax but just want to work in a different role. You're listening to the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 71.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone and welcome to this episode. Tony Stevenson started working in tax straight after university, working in corporation tax at Deloitte. Early on, Tony decided that tax wasn't a good fit for him, but he was convinced to stick it out, to get his professional qualification and experience at Deloitte for the good of his CV, but he ended up staying in tax for 9 years, even though he'd often tell people how much he disliked working in it. The problem was that Tony knew what he didn't want, but he didn't know what he actually wanted. He didn't realise that though until a particular experience that he had, which he shares with us in this episode. He also couldn't afford to take a huge cut in pay, and as you'll hear, his move out of tax actually resulted in a pay rise, as he leveraged his knowledge and experience. He shares what I think is an excellent piece of advice, which will allow you to do the same. In the episode, you'll also hear what was going through Tony's mind when he decided to try a role outside of tax and why he felt like tax wasn't for him, the value Tony got from his time working in tax, the worries and concerns Tony had about moving out of tax, and his advice in relation to this and what he should do before moving out of tax, what Tony did to not move for less salary and in fact move for more, non-tax roles that could be a good fit for people with tax experience, the importance of your hook and why you should find it, about taking ownership of your career and the benefits this brings, and Tony's advice for people considering moving out of tax. You can find rough timings for each of these sections within the details section of the episode within your podcast player of choice, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP71. That is the only link you'll need to remember for this episode, thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP71. All of the links mentioned are included in there. Over the past few weeks, I've been busy delivering numerous webinars. I've probably done more in the past few weeks than I have in the past 2 years. It's just been crazy, and I've been doing this alongside the noise of having some building work done at home. Definitely my favourite webinars to do, though, were for the tax research masterclass that I do, and I'm aiming to create a tax advice masterclass in the next few months. Details of all masterclasses will be on my website, thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. The next tax research masterclass is in September this year, and it's designed to give you and other tax professionals the practical skills to undertake tax research, basically find the answer to any tax question and then to document it. If you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James from the tax recruitment company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. Speaking with James would help you to negotiate a pay rise or determine it's time to find a new role. Contact details for James can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP71, or you can book a chat with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So get in touch with James to benchmark your salary or to discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he's currently recruiting for many roles in this area. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. Could you just start off by giving us a bit of an introduction about yourself and a little bit about your career to date?
Absolutely, mate, no problem at all. So I currently am the Senior Digital Enablement Manager at Free Agent, but it's probably easier to start from the beginning of my career, which kind of splits quite neatly into two fairly distinct and similar sized portions. So the first 9 years of my career, I bounced around practice and industry. So I left university, the University of Reading, where I went kind of not with a huge amount of idea about really what I wanted to do, but having had a conversation with a careers advisor, he'd advised me to maybe take a look at tax after we'd ruled out investment banking on the basis that I didn't want to work 90 hours a week and I didn't want to work in the city. So I went to work managed to get offers from Deloitte and PwC, and had managed to get them secured kind of before the end of my degree, much to my own surprise, because I'm not the most proactive of people. I ended up kind of trading them off against each other, and Deloitte just sort of felt like the better alignment to my kind of people. So I went to work in the corporation tax team in the Deloitte Reading office, where I was at for about 3.5 years. I ended up getting made voluntary arrangement it was. And when the credit crunch happened, there was a bunch of people that got let go, and I was one of them. Got given the choice to stick around or take a check, so I took the check and ran. I then had a little bit of time because obviously there was quite a flood of people on the market looking for work around that time. But I ended up going to work in industry. So I went into a corporation tax role in industry where I spent about a year and a half, just over that. So I went to work for BlackBerry, and I was doing kind of like in-house corporation tax kind of compliance and a bit of advisory, and that's quite cool. I quite enjoyed that. And that lasted for about 18 months. That ended with my first foray out of working in tax, where I went to work in recruitment for a recruiting company that recruited tax professionals. So that was kind of my first segue out. That lasted about 6 months, and I kind of worked out fairly quickly that I didn't think recruitment was quite for me. So I then ended up kind of going back into practice with a role that sort of initially was sort of planned to be a short-term tread water position until I found something more kind of aligned to where I wanted to go. I ended up being there for about 3 years, and that was kind of a local sort of small, medium-sized firm, about 60 staff, corporation tax, and some time spent on a sort of niche area of hospitality accounting, helping restaurants to manage their tips. I then managed to make my sort of what was my final move out of tax that stuck, and went to work for Xero. So I went to work in their implementation team. So I was at Xero for a couple of years. I'm sure we'll delve into these various bits in a bit more detail later on. That's kind of from an overview perspective. I was in their implementation team for a couple of years. I then went traveling for a year, which is why I left Xero. Didn't go back there because it just kind of didn't have a progression role for me when I got back. Ended up working for had a couple of shorter stints in other software houses in sales roles, which didn't quite work out. Joined Free Agent 4.5 years ago now. Joined in a sales role. I think I'd done enough to convince myself that pure sales wasn't for me. Again, not being the most proactive of people doesn't align particularly well being a salesperson. Went back into the implementation team or went into the implementation team at Free Agent. And then I've sort of now crafted myself quite a unique role, I guess, at Free Agent that covers a whole bunch of different things around thought leadership, around helping to equip Free Agent with some of my practice-based experience and knowledge, and then also sort of dealing with our integration partners as well. So a whole bunch of kind of different stuff. So that's the semi-potted history, mate.
So this is actually the job you've had for the longest ever then, isn't it? 4.5 years.
It actually is, yes. It actually is, believe it or not.
Maybe then you have finally found what is like your ultimate calling then.
It could be that, yes.
So obviously you did make that or kind of move out of tax like twice in a way then. So kind of what was going through your head at the time then when you first went into the recruitment role, and then I suppose secondly when you made that jump to Xero, because it seems like you were kind of unsure about tax for a while in a way, and then finally just thought, that's it, I'm done. Let's do something completely different for the rest of my career.
Indeed. So I guess I'm probably not dissimilar to, I'm sure, a number of your listeners, mate, in the sense that I, maybe thought, perhaps this doesn't quite align to where I thought my skill set was. I worked out very quickly that tax wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and wasn't what I felt aligned with where I kind of wanted to end up. And there was a number of reasons for that. I would say I worked it out as early as week 2. And I was kind of told, you know what, and I actually was told in good faith, and this probably would have been the case, that, look, see out your time at Deloitte, get that on your CV, get your ACA completed, and then, the world will be your oyster once you've done that. No one will ever be able to take it away from you. And it was good advice, right? Even now, when you say, I trained in the Big Four, people kind of go, oh, maybe that's just a reflection of me, actually. And no, I wasn't expecting you to say that. But actually, it really, really does kind of, stand you in good stead. It proves that you've got, resilience and that you compete at the top kind of thing. I ended up kind of in a position where I just felt like, do you know what, actually, the first time I left was very much based on just there's a kind of opportunity there. I had a conversation with the recruiter that I'd spent a lot of time working with to get my position, and he said, look, we're always looking for people who've got that experience. I kind of jumped into it on the basis of it can't be a bad move, because I just kind of know that I don't want to end up here, and therefore, just doing something that's different, that's willing to pay me a decent wage in comparison to what I was earning previously, and then the opportunity to learn new skills and all that kind of stuff was there. So I jumped into it a little bit naively, if I'm honest, and I definitely didn't regret it, because I learned in that 6 months probably one of the richest learning periods in my career, in the sense that I learned an awful lot about sales and how to sell to people, and and the different forms that takes. But I probably hadn't given it a huge amount of consideration in the way that I did when I moved permanently later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So what was it about tax that kind of wasn't right for you then? Can you put your finger on anything in particular?
So yes. So the thing that kind of drove me, I guess, was ultimately, whatever way I looked at it, I kind of didn't see a ladder that I wanted to climb. And the main problem that I had was I always felt this really unnerving sense that I was giving advice that I didn't really, I wasn't confident that I was 100%. I know that this is definitely the case in absolutely everything that I'm talking about. I didn't like the uncertainty of it. And obviously when you're saying, right, okay, so here's this complicated capital allowances situation, and we think this is the right call. I could never find the edges of everything. I always found it really difficult to kind of know whether I'd considered everything or not. And I really didn't like that situation of being in that place where you were going to somebody saying this is definitely right, and it could potentially cost them quite a lot of money if you were wrong.
Yeah.
And I wasn't very good at kind of retaining the tax knowledge. I was like, you give me sports statistics and I can retain it immediately, because for some reason my brain wants to hold on to that, but I could just never seem to retain the legislation in a way that made me feel comfortable. And it was always kind of like, I'd always find myself in this situation where I was like, we've considered everything, and then I go to the the director or the partner or whatever and be like, look, this is what I think, this is based on all these things, and they just seem to manage to just be able to pull this piece of legislation or case law out of a hat that I had no idea where it had come from and no idea how I was supposed to know it. It all felt very unsystemized and I always kind of felt like I was sort of chasing my tail around, and and I discovered, I guess, that in order to kind of progress and get to the point where you're running a business rather than being a tax advisor, that was the bit I wanted to get to, but I couldn't get good enough at tax in order to to reach that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I think actually there's probably a lot of people that feel similar about that. And actually, the thing that you're talking about there, which is what you like the least, is actually what I like the most, to be honest. I think it goes to show then, doesn't it? If you don't like that area of tax, it becomes more difficult, I suppose, to fall in love with it in a way, because it's a big part of it. It almost sounds like, actually, Tony, the tax research masterclass that I've created would have been perfect for you back then.
We sort of, I think I messaged you when I saw it to say, this is definitely something that would have helped me tremendously, because I just always felt like I was 3 steps behind, like everyone knew something I didn't, and I couldn't work out how they knew things that I didn't. And I'm somebody that I like to understand the game that I'm playing, and I like to understand the rules of the game that I'm playing, and know that I either know everything or I know what I don't know. And that was the thing. I couldn't get my head around that the unknown was just too big for me. And I just ended up in that situation where I just always felt, like I said, like I was chasing my tail, and and it didn't excite me either. It didn't lift me up. I'm more of a creative and a people person, rather than just bury me in a book and let me find the rules kind of guy. So yeah.
So in a way, it was almost like a good experience, because it helped you realise a few of those things, and then I suppose helped you to figure out what you wanted to do, because you've almost taken the elements that you probably liked, right? Because you do probably quite a lot of people facing now, and more so when you move to zero, which it sounds like you like more of.
Hmm.
So you kind of got to experience that from the tax role as well, I bet.
Yeah, and there was quite a lot of it's funny, like the old Steve Jobs Stanford commencement speech, when you look back at and connect the dots as to, well, why was I put in that situation, and why did I, why did my career path teach me these things, and actually the lesson was to learn the lessons out of them.
Yeah.
And actually, when I look back on it now, I think, well, do you know what, my brain would have hurt an awful lot less if I'd understood the reasons why. But unfortunately, hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? You can't sit there at the time and have the benefit of hindsight, because you don't know what's coming later down the track. But I look at it now and I go, it was incredibly valuable to be able to understand, how, because tax touches everything. So even, from that perspective, it gave me a really good insight into the firms that I worked with, because tax was part of everything. It wasn't just a sort of standalone function. It was, you had to deal with accounts and, and R&D and audit and, and the personal tax team and all that kind of stuff. You really got a good understanding of how these things interacted, and, where were the bits that you needed to know, who to speak to, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it definitely gave me a load of insight that I have put to huge use in my future career.
Yeah. It sounds like you've done a pretty good job, actually, of, I suppose, realizing what you like and then finding a job to fit that. That's like also used the knowledge that you learned, or some of the knowledge at least that you learned, from your tax days, because kind of understanding that practice environment and the industry environment as well, I suppose, has helped you then in your new roles, right? Because in sales stuff, you need to, I suppose, know what the pain points are, what could benefit people, etc., who work in those roles, and you probably have a better understanding than people who obviously haven't worked in tax around those things.
It's interesting because I've worked with a lot of people in my industry who haven't ever worked in accountancy firms, and you do find there are people that are able to kind of grasp it and get their heads around it, having never worked in it. There was a guy that I used to work with at Xero, and I'm sure he won't mind me pulling him out as a good example of this, but a guy called Ian Phillips, and he's now head of one of the sales teams in Xero, and he always stood out for me as somebody who was really, really good, despite having never worked in that background, at understanding how these things worked. But it's not always the case. A lot of people that I've worked with in these industries aren't able to pick that stuff up because they haven't lived it, and it definitely gives you a competitive advantage in that sense. Mm-hmm.
If I were in your shoes at the time anyway, when particularly on that move to Xero, I would have been probably worried about quite a few different things, right? I have this thing in my mind about like wasting time as well, because obviously you spent, was it almost 9 years in there, and I'll be thinking like, I've spent nine years here, and I'm potentially going to put that 9 years to waste by making a move out. And I'd probably also be quite concerned about trying to find a role that would actually suit me going forward and stuff as well, amongst other things. Did you kind of have any of your own concerns at the time when you were making that almost like full-time move out of tax?
Definitely, mate. So I think I've thought about this quite a bit before, and it was definitely something that I resonated with. It was definitely something people put to me quite a lot as well. Like, oh, you've done this qualification, and you're basically just going to turn your back on it. And there's like thousands of people who, pay thousands of pounds out of their own money to do this qualification, which you got as part of your job, and you're just going to kind of turn your back on it. And essentially you've got two choices. You can either get over it, or you can find something that allows you to still continue to use it, but not necessarily in the kind of day-to-day sense that you were using it previously. And I was able to do that, fortunately. I think that I still use the stuff that I learned in my qualification and the stuff that I learned sort of, doing my time in practice, particularly, certainly every week. Maybe not every day, but certainly every week there's something that comes up that I have an understanding of because of that training and because of that background. So if you are somebody that wants to make a complete move into something that is completely different, having an understanding of accounts and tax is a useful application in an awful lot of walks, more so than you would think. But if you are somebody that wants to change from being an accountant to being a chef, then you probably are just going to kind of have to lump it and go, do you know what, like, it's led me to this place, and it's never going to be a complete waste of time, but actually it's just not something that I can continue to use on a day-to-day basis anymore, and I'm just gonna kind of have to get comfortable with that, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it's almost like a decision between being miserable in your work for the rest of your life, or just sucking up that you might not get as much use from your qualification or your experience that you would have liked. But it's a hard decision for people, right? Because, well, I would find it difficult. I know that much. I know I would.
And it's the sunk cost fallacy, isn't it? In the sense that you're like, well, if I put 3 years worth of my life into training, and another 6 years into the other time that I've spent there, from a very early point in that journey, I kind of knew that I probably wasn't going to end up there. So mentally, I'd had a long time to get used to the idea of not using that stuff on a day-to-day basis. And I look back on it and I think, do you know what? Like, if I'd known that at 9 years I was going to get out, I would have got so much more out of that period, because I would have been able to go into it with a much better mindset. And like, my mindset towards career and job has gradually improved. I started out with a not particularly good mindset towards career and job, and it's there's been some light bulb moments along the way that have moved me in a better direction, certainly. And I'm certainly at the best place I've been in terms of my attitude towards work, and and how I put myself across, and how I get the most out of my skills. But yeah, it is definitely something you've got to wrestle with. But my advice, if people are thinking about it, is kind of, don't let that be the thing that keeps you miserable. You could go, oh, do you know what? If I've got an opportunity now, but I'm just a bit about moving it, look forward 10 years and go, oh, do you know what? Do I want to carry on doing the same thing that sort of makes me unhappy on a day-to-day basis just because I've spent a lot of time doing it? Like, that to me was a worse choice than just kind of having to get used to not doing it every day. And actually, I was probably a bad example, because I kind of actively wanted to not use it on a day-to-day basis. So maybe I wasn't a good example.
Yeah. Did you have any other things that you were kind of worried about at the time, or that you're maybe concerned about?
So one thing that I was very concerned about, which I think a lot of people will find that they're in, if they're sitting there now thinking, you know what, I'm listening to Tony talk about this because it's something that I kind of want to do, was making the wrong move. So that sort of decision paralysis of like, what if I choose the wrong thing and then I end up in another place that I don't want to be in? And I kind of played this whole thing out, and this might help some people. So the first time when I made the move into recruitment, I hadn't really given it much thought. I hadn't really given much thought to any kind of process behind it. And that's probably why it didn't stick. And also because actually, it probably wasn't a good fit for me. And I kind of maybe knew that on some level. Tim Ferriss uses this example an awful lot, and I always remember it stuck with me when I first heard him talk about it on a podcast. And it's he calls it fear setting. So you kind of say, right, okay, so what's the worst thing that could happen? So I move into this new job and I hate it. Okay, then what are my options? So my options are, potentially I could move into another new job that is completely different, or what I could actually do is go, do you know what? This was so much worse than what I actually had previously. I can go back to it. What if I can't go back to my job? Excuse me. Then I can probably go back to another job that is similar. And actually, there's not a lot that you can't undo. And sometimes, career changes that I've known, their first bullet and it's done and it's perfect, because they've always known, what I've always wanted to do is be a photographer. And, eventually they've managed to make that stick, and, and that's been fine. A lot of people are stuck in careers that they don't like because they actually don't know what they want. And that was my problem. I had no idea. I had become conditioned for reasons that I far too deep and long-winded to go into now. But that was the difference. The second time I worked with a careers coach, it was a guy called Phil Bolton, who ironically had ended up being an ex-Deloitte alum. And he'd gone into careers coaching. So he'd worked for Deloitte for 10 or 12 years, had a very similar story to mine, and we worked together. And I always remember, I sent him this email many years after we worked together to sort of thank him for what he gave me, because what I wanted him to give me when I went to speak to him was, here's a list of people that I know in jobs that aren't tax, and I will put you in front of them and vouch for you and get you a slot in front of people, and you'll just find a magical new job that isn't tax. and he didn't give me that at all. And at the time, I was quite frustrated because I was like, I've paid you a few £100, and and we've ended up in this situation where I don't really have what I wanted, which was you to just take this off me. What he gave me was far more valuable. So what he made me realize was that I didn't know what I wanted, and that was as much of the problem as like me being in the wrong job was me kind of not actually having any idea about what it was that I wanted. It was, he asked it to me in one of the first sessions that we did, and he said, well, what do you want in your job? And I was kind of like, well, I tell you what I don't want in my job. And he says, that's not what I've asked you. I want you to tell me what you do want in your job. And I was like, I literally couldn't answer him.
Yeah.
I couldn't answer him. And I had to go and eat some personal humble pie and realize that whilst I'd rattled on for what was probably 5 or 6 years at this point about not wanting to do this, all I was doing was repeating what I didn't want. And even then I wasn't 100% clear on exactly what it was that I didn't want. I just didn't want to be doing what I was doing, but I didn't have any idea about what I was doing. And there's, a lot more resource out there than there was probably when I was doing this to help you to find out, well, yeah, the first step is like, what is it that I actually don't like about what I'm doing? And even now, 8-9 years after, I had a realization the other day about a large part of why I didn't like what I was doing was actually down to nothing more than geography.
Okay.
So a large part of it was although I present externally as an extrovert, and I am an extrovert in the sense that I like people and I like standing on stages and talking and yakking on social media and doing all that kind of stuff. Whilst it lights me up from a creative perspective, it drains me emotionally, and I like a lot of solitude and a lot of my own time, my own company, and not being around people. Being forced to go into an office 5 days a week every single week, I had this realization recently that actually that was a really large part of why I didn't like doing the job that I did, because I was always forced to go into an office. I couldn't work from home. Now I couldn't work in an office. I could maybe go in 1 day a week possibly. Mm-hmm. But working from home to me is a non-negotiable tenet of my my employment. Is I have to be able to work from home the majority of the time, because otherwise I just end up miserable.
Yeah, to be fair, I'm exactly the same as you in that, I enjoy speaking to people and spending time with them, but I also need a lot of time by myself where I can get my energy back. And if I don't have that, it just makes me snappy and not as happy, etc. But yeah, it's the same here.
And people they're always astonished when I tell them this. People that don't know me well, that know me well enough to know what I'm like when I am around people, but don't know me well enough to know that is, that's something that I require is a lot of kind of, my own sort of time. So
yeah. I think actually it's just a worthwhile point mentioning it's okay to want time by yourself, right? I feel like sometimes it's pushed so much that you should be spending a lot of time in front of people, whether it's clients or colleagues, etc. But is it necessary type thing? And I think it is necessary to have some of it, but not as much as what's advocated, I think, by quite a lot of people.
Yeah, I find myself, it exhausts me, because I always feel this obligation when I'm in a room to be the energy in the room. Mm-hmm. And not everyone feels that obligation, but because I do and I give that energy, I'm sure some people will be like, well, you're talking about Tone, but mentally I do, at least from my purely my perspective. It does, it kind of means that I then have to kind of replenish my own stores by, walking and working out and, spending time by myself.
Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or discuss available tax roles. Get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company. His contact details can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP71, or you can book a call with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. You can also find details on my masterclasses created purely for tax professionals at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. I would say just then, as like a little summary key point, then I think it's useful to take away from what you kind of just said about that story with having the career coach, and that is is to really think about what you do want, you know, spend time thinking about that, because I suppose otherwise you'll end up in the same situation you were when you moved to that recruitment role, because you still hadn't thought about it. It still didn't work for you because you still didn't know what you want to that point. And it sounds like by the point you moved to zero, you did know what you want, at least with quite a lot of confidence. I know it's impossible to know 100%, isn't it, until you try it, but you were at least fairly confident, I imagine, at that point.
Exactly. And I reached this point of, so I knew, I went for the interviews and I was like, do you know what? You know, they're willing to kind of pay me a bit more than I was earning in practice, which was great. And that was a big barrier for me at the time. I wasn't in a financial position to take any sort of significant pay cut. I could have maybe taken a couple of grand, but I'd got myself into this this situation where I was kind of like, I can't start again. I'm too dependent upon the money that I've got now that I'm earning, and it wasn't huge amounts. But I can't take a 15 grand pay cut to go and start again in marketing, even though I think that might be something that, you know, I want to do. I'm not sure enough to be able to take that pay cut and, you know, and put myself in that financial situation because, you know, I like my life arrangement too much, and I just couldn't afford to do it. So, yeah, I was definitely in a better position, but there was still an element of, I need to hold my nose and jump in the river and just trust that I'll come up the other side, if you know what I mean. There was still some sort of like, I've got to as far as I can, as Barack Obama talks about, you know, you only need to be 51% sure to make a decision, because, you know, that's the best you're going to get to, is on balance of probability, it's this.
Yeah.
And it is similar, you know, like I look back on it now. I had this conversation with somebody recently. I do a lot of presenting and public speaking, talking and stuff like that, and it doesn't bother me now. But when I moved into working for Xero, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified about public speaking, and I just ignored it and just jumped in anyway, even though I kind of sort of, if I'd investigated the role in a bit more detail and asked questions around that, I'd have talked myself out of it. And actually, I just went, do you know what? You're just going to have to get good at it. We'll kick that can down the road. We'll come, you know, and we'll make the key decision, which is sign that contract, get your notice period negotiated, and get out the door, and worry about the rest of it later. And, you know, you've got this. You've got to do this. There was just something there that I was just like, I've just got to do this. I know that this is the right thing for me to do, and, you know, and I just had to kind of, you know, as I say, hold my nose, jump in the river, and trust that I'd come up the other side. No, I did.
And I know you said like you couldn't take like a 15 grand pay cut or whatever to start at the bottom and say a marketing role, but it actually sounds like you've almost ended up in the same place anyway with the role you got now, or it's a similar place.
Yeah, I ended up. It's probably why it took me so long, because that was one of my non-negotiable criteria. Is I'm not willing to take a significant pay cut. I'd have taken a bit of one, maybe 5 at the max, but I couldn't take any more than that. And that was probably why it took me so long. So if you're in a situation where you can kind of go, oh, do you know what, I can rearrange my life. Maybe I can move home for a bit. Maybe I've got some savings or that kind of stuff. I had no savings. You know, I was in a bit of debt, so I just didn't have that choice. It had to be a jump, and it had to be similar, or, you know, ideally better. And then it ended up being better. So I was kind of lucky in that sense, I suppose. But what I managed to do was I managed to find a place to leverage what I had that was valuable into my new role, which is not what everyone wants to do, but it was what I did, and it got me over the line.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to note actually that you did end up actually moving out of tax into a non-tax role and actually ended up getting a pay rise. Because I think a lot of people would automatically think that you're going to have to take a cut, but not always. It's
doable.
So I know you said when you went to your career coach that you wanted that like list of roles that you could kind of go into in a way, or people to speak to that are in non-tax roles who maybe have worked there before. And I'm still going to ask you this question anyway, even though you didn't get that answer at the time, because I still think it'll be somewhat useful to people to at least get a bit of an idea. But what kind of like non-tax roles do you think exist out there that could be a good fit for people who have actually got experience in tax?
So I think if I talk from a software perspective, the software world is always looking for people that have experience in practice. So at Free Agent, we've just hired a role where we were looking for somebody who had practice experience to kind of go and work with accountants. And I've experienced it for a long time, where I know that when people see FCA after my name and I say, oh, do you know what, I'm qualified, I'm chartered, I trained in practice, And I've worked in practice for nearly a decade. You can feel them start to talk to you differently. So there's a whole bunch of different roles. So like implementation is definitely one that matches up nicely with having spent time in practice, because it just gives you a sympathy for the processes and the hierarchy and the services that are offered, that allows you to really kind of get into, okay, so how does it work currently? What are we trying to achieve? Okay, I can see that these are potential barriers or blockers that might get in your way. So implementation, definitely. Sales roles, again, definitely. It's not always a natural marriage, selling and people coming out of the profession, because we tend to be more introverted as a profession, the accountancy profession. But that probably wasn't me. And actually, you'd probably be surprised how process driven sales is. The actual selling and being good at persuading people of things is actually a relatively small part of being a good salesperson. It's far more about system structure, taking them through a process, and so it's probably a lot more crossover and things that you would think that there were.
Yeah.
There was a load of people in my old office and profession that went into something called product control, which I don't even know if it still exists. I imagine there's probably just a piece of software that does it, but essentially it used to be like preparing kind of a daily P&L for traders. And there was several people I knew that went into doing something like that out of the profession. But that was, we're talking 10, 15 years ago now, that was a big thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's not an avenue that gets explored. But there's a whole ton of crossover stuff. And I think that from the software world, there's support, you can find a home there. Sometimes marketing, although it's probably less easy of a crossover. There's certainly implementation, customer success, support, sales. There's a whole bunch of stuff there from a software perspective.
So when you're talking about these like things like software implementation and sales, do you think that they need to have some kind of connection to tax or related to tax in order for it to be like an easy move for people? Or could someone just move from tax to, say, a sales role selling, I don't know, widgets is the example everyone uses, right? Is that possible still too? Or do you think it makes more sense to move into, say, selling, I don't know, tax software or tax books, something that's related to tax still in some way?
So I think that definitely something that's related to accountancy in some way really helps. And what you also might need to appreciate is that like Rome wasn't built in a day. So you might find that actually, do you know what? I'm pretty sure that selling is the thing that I want to do. And actually what I want to do is I want to work in a radio environment where I'm selling advertising space on the radio. So I'm just picking something completely random that one of my friends does. And you might go, okay, so I've got to make a couple of traverses. So I might go, do you know what? Actually, I've worked in practice. So my first step is going to be to go to my practice and say, look, everyone around us is doing a bit of the business development stuff, but I think I could probably do a pretty good job of this as a career. How do you feel about kind of giving me a trial of one day a month or one day a week or something like that, in order for me to kind of take on some of the business development stuff that maybe some of my colleagues around me don't really want to do, and I'll see how I can see what I can do about that. And then that might lead you down the path of, oh, do you know what? Actually, that was really successful because you went away and did a lot of, self-owned research, and there's tons of YouTube rabbit holes that you could go down on about selling and all that kind of stuff. That proves to people that you've got that, and then it might be that actually, do you know what? I can now, did that for 6 months or a year, and that was quite successful, but actually I reached a bit of the ceiling with my current provider, and actually, do you know what? Maybe I can now go and confidently show to an accountancy software company that I could sell accountancy software because I've been selling accountancy services within the accountancy software. They'll jump on that, right? If they're looking for that crossover of somebody that understands it but also has sales skills. And then you might go, right, okay, so I probably need to do 2 or 3 years in here and be successful, right? I need to be, hitting my quota and, and doing well here. But then actually suddenly after a while, it becomes sales is the thing that I do. It just happens to be for an accountancy software company. So you then go and apply for, a job at Capital Radio selling advertising space, and you might have to, kind of maybe take a slightly lower position because you don't have a network in the industry or a bit of experience, but actually suddenly you've made 2 or 3 moves that have ended up getting to where you wanted to get to, but not necessarily by jumping in one go. And I think part of the mistake I made was I didn't really know where I wanted to go, but also I was kind of like, well, I want to go and do that head of something role that is nothing to do with anything that I've got any experience in. And actually, I just think I could do it, but I haven't proven to anybody by doing anything particular that I could. And, and that kind of thing is probably going to be a lot more difficult to execute in one jump than if you go, do you know what, actually, let me think about this. I'm fairly sure that's the general direction that I want to go in. So I've got to start making moves to get there in, 2 or 3 or 4 steps, right?
Yeah. I like that because it's then like transferring your knowledge slowly in a way, right? Because you're always using what you already know and then like adding to it.
Yep.
And then you kind of moving further and further away from where you started out, but you keep adding to yourself. So like, for example, have definitely got like a real unique set of skills and knowledge, I'm sure, which no one else out there probably has to the same extent as you, right? Because you've kept doing those slightly different things all the time. I think it's just a good thought, yeah. For people to start getting more experience in something, like you said, BD as an example, getting more experience in BD, learning more about that is then for the stepping stone to go into a more full-time BD role, potentially, or a sales role. It just makes sense. And I know you're using sales as an example there, but I suppose you could do it with quite a few things. Because let's say now that I wanted to move into doing, I don't know, tax software, for example, I could use my employment tax knowledge to go out there and help build software that relates to employment tax things for people to use, right? I can't code at this point, not to any good degree anyway, but then I could start learning coding, for example, and then combine those 2 pieces of knowledge, right? I think that's kind of what you're saying, and you can do it with anything.
100%. And I think that it really helps if you know where you want to get to, right? So, it's actually a friend of my wife's, and she worked as a teacher. And she managed to get a role working in, I can't remember the exact company it was, but she managed to get a role doing kind of like education, but in like a kind of software world, but her education was a crossover. And then she managed to get them to agree to let her train as a coder. And she coded and then realized that actually, she probably wasn't quite cut out for the coding. She wasn't quite cut out for the coding side of things, but what she really enjoyed was like the product management side of things. So she then kind of trained herself up and started to edge in that direction, and then has ended up kind of becoming a product manager. And she's done it in a number of steps. It's not, you don't have to kind of jump to that final end point. You just perhaps need to find, right, okay, so this is the area that I kind of want to move into. And then start to make steps in that direction and look for the crossovers, look for the what I call the hook. So one of the things that I used to do, might be jumping ahead to one of your later questions, Jack, but one of the things that I did is to try and make this happen was just started reading, right? So I just stuck career change accountants into Google, and then you'll find articles of people that have done this. And it used to frustrate the hell out of me every single time, because every single time I read one of these articles, I was just waiting to get to the point where I found what I called the hook, which was I met a girl and we got engaged, and her dad owned a company in this area and he asked me to come over and do a job. Or like, I started a blog in food and then I ended up, moving over into being accountant in a big food company, and then I took a little segue there and moved internally, and there was almost always some link between what the person had done previously and what they'd moved into. And that might have been a connection or a network, it might have been a skill, or it might have been something that they had started themselves and proven to the person that was potentially going to hire them that they had some skills in that area or some appetite to go and prove that they could do this, rather than just asking people to take a punt on it. And it just used to frustrate me so much until I realized what my hook was, and I never asked myself that question. It took me so long because I was doing all this on my own and just wasn't self-aware enough at the time to really sit back and reflect. It's nowhere near as easy to do it when you're trying to do it for yourself as it is to try and do it for somebody else. And then I realized, was like, well, your hook is you're an accountant, and I just never knew that there was this whole software world out there that potentially would value that in a way that meant that I would be rewarded, wouldn't have to take a big pay cut, but actually, could move that across. And now people would read my story and go, oh, well, his hook was he was an accountant and he moved to work in accounting software. It's a fairly obvious and, an unsophisticated move, but you kind of got to work out what your hook is. And if you don't have one, then you potentially need to work out how you can create one.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think as well, actually, another thing I've kind of almost spotted from the few stories that you've told is that each person that seems to make these career moves and keeps making them into something slightly different is driving it themselves. It's not someone else that's driving it for them. You've taken control of it. You've done a lot of personal development and professional development by the sounds of it. And so has that teacher who moved into the education role that you talked about. Both of you have driven it yourself. You haven't sat there waiting for someone to drive it for you. And I suppose you've done everything you can to keep improving yourself and then enable yourself to demonstrate that to a potential employer or for an interviewer interviewing you for a new role, right?
It's absolutely about ownership more so than ever, because especially if you work for a big organization like I did, it's very easy. You just get spoon fed everything all the time. So it's just like, here's your work to do. Here's your PDP structure. You just need to change a few lines. There's no requirement for you to really own anything yourself. You just turn up and it gets handed to you. And that creates this, my mind of like, why is no one just recognized that I would be great at doing something that isn't what I'm doing currently? I was like, because no one cares about you who doesn't know you, and also because you haven't proven anything to them either. You're just asking them to take a punt on it based on the hope that they like you, if you can get in front of them. And that does happen, but usually it happens because you've got the right mindset, and that mindset is just, this is my thing. I can go out and pay people to help me with it, and I'll be forever grateful to Phil for doing that. But you ultimately need to realize that this is your thing, and if you want to make this change, then you're going to have to drive it. You're going to have to work out what it looks like, and then you're going to have to take the relevant steps to do that.
Yeah, makes sense. And I don't think people actually in my generation in particular take enough ownership of those things. That they wait for the spoon fed, because in school spoon fed, college spoon fed, university spoon fed. If you go to a big four like what you've talked about, a lot of spoon feeding, and so you've never known anything different, really, have you? So I can understand it at the same time, but as soon as you take that ownership, I feel like it's a different world in a way.
It's night and day. It's night and day. It's absolutely night and day. And it's not just career change. It's like it's everything. When you take ownership of stuff and go, right, it's up to me. If something goes wrong, then okay, it's an opportunity to learn. And actually, could I have done something different? Like, it always helps me if something goes wrong. If I look back far enough, I can usually find a point of ownership that I failed on. And actually, then I can kind of go, do you know what? That was a lesson to be learned in the future. And actually that, you need to be, you take the example, right? So it's like, let's say you want to move into the food industry. And you work as an accountant, but you've done absolutely nothing at all to prove that to anybody. Or take the opposite example of, right, so I work in accountancy, but what I've done is positioned myself to work on hospitality firms because I'm a bit of a foodie and that's what I want to do. Oh, and also in my spare time, I started an Instagram that I cook on, and you share my recipes, and I've started learning how to do video, and and actually what I've built a bit of a following, and maybe I've built something that I can sell to people through that following, and I've worked out how to monetize that. Suddenly, like, there's half a dozen skills and proof of interest and proof of ability in that area there that somebody can look at and go, oh wow, like, this person's really taken the initiative and owned it and gone and found it themselves, versus I've just sat here in my day job waiting for the thing to fall into my lap, which is what I did. So
yeah. So you have kind of answered this somewhat already, but I know you have helped kind of a few people make that career change from tax into a different role. So I know you've got valuable advice around this, and you've given a lot already throughout the episode, but have you kind of got anything else that you don't think you've covered yet? Advice to people who are having second thoughts about working in tax and moving out to it?
Yeah, so I think there's there's kind of, as I said, when we first started talking about doing this podcast episode, Jack, there was a number of different bits that it kind of made me sit down and think, oh, do you know what, actually, if I was sitting down with somebody again and giving them this advice, I could probably do it in a slightly more structured fashion than I had done previously with other people. But there's kind of 5 broad steps to it. So I think the first step is, like, what is it you don't like about your current existence, role, job? What is it? Is it actually that you have to come into work every day, and actually you could change that quite simply by saying, I want to work hybrid, and if not, I'll go and work somewhere else that will allow me to work hybrid. I don't think that would have solved it in the longer term for me, but it certainly would have made things easier for me. It wouldn't have been an option then. It wasn't offered, and it wasn't what the world did then. So that was kind of ruled out. And then this was the hardest one for me, was what do I actually want my life to look like? And the exercise that changed this for me was sit down, imagine you have unlimited funds and unlimited time. You have no restrictions on your time. Map out what a perfect year would look like for you. Like, what are the things that would go into that year? Who are the people you would spend time with? What are the projects that you would start? Just imagine you had like an absolute free pass to set yourself up for the rest of your life. Like, what would you do in that year? So, like, just saying I would go traveling around the world and, you know, spend all my money on popping bottles in clubs and stuff is probably not the answer that we're looking for here, as fun as that would be, I'm sure. You know, it's what industries do I want to be involved with? You know, if I play rugby, do I want to be involved in the sports industry? If I'm into food, do I want to be involved in the food industry? Do I want to write a book? Do I want to be a podcaster? Like, you know, just kind of really brainstorm it. No idea is too big or too silly or whatever, and work that out. That was an exercise that really helped me. Taking your ownership, finding your hook, and showing people, not just telling them, was real kind of overarching themes. But then when you kind of get into the practicalities of it, there was 3 final steps. So looking at your current job, is there a way that you could improve that to work on more relevant things, or more things that you would enjoy? Is there a client set you could work with? Is there some, you know, could you get approval for half a day a week to go and work with the sales team, or work with the marketing team, or you know, build something on social media, or whatever it might be? If you work for a bigger company, could you move internally? Because that's often a really easy way to make this happen, or much easier, because they know you're good and they know you've got a good attitude to work, which is 90% of the battle, right? Could you move internally, or could you make, you know, if it's a big company, you're like, well, maybe one of my friends who's moved out of tax and moved into RevOps, so reporting on how the sales team's doing in his company, right? So he actually did move to do this role, but I said to him, I was like, could you not go to them and say, could I go and work in that department for half a day a week, or a day a week, or second there for, you know, a month to see if I actually like it or not? And I said to him, have you done that? And he was like, no, I'd never even really thought to go and ask them if there was anything different I could do internally. And that's something that, you know, should be a first port of call. Like, make sure you've exhausted all the easy options, because it's really easy to overlook stuff because it's right in front of you. And then step 5 is, you know, like, rattle your network. So your network's everything, right? Jobs now, it'd be difficult for me to foresee an opportunity if I wanted to leave free agent, which I don't particularly, but if I wanted to, it would be highly unlikely that I would be going applying on any job board or anything like that. I would be calling people that I knew in the industry saying, look, you know, I'm looking for a new role. Has anybody got anything that's going? Or, you know, I can see that that's a particular thing. I'd reach out to them on social or whatever, and you know, and start to rattle my network and work out how I can, you know, use that network hook to get myself in there, and, you know, and start to move the needle in the direction that I've defined where I want to go, right?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think probably the key one there is trying to do everything you can to find a better role for the place you work for. I think a lot of people just overlook that and think, well, they're not going to want me to move from this role because they like me in this role. Well, if the option is lose you or keep you, but just in a different role, I think most employers will want to keep you just in a different role. Obviously, if you're not a terrible employee, which I'm sure none of you are there listening, so it's a much easier choice than you say than going externally, because the internal people, in a different team will probably know who you are, right? Have a bit of a feel for how good or bad you are at things, whereas the external people don't have any of that.
Nope.
They don't have the luxury.
And also something that's really occurred to me while we've been talking about this is that it's very easy to get into a bit of a spiral, and that's probably what I did. So if you went and asked my last employer, and I kind of know this through a sort of roundabout way, one of the guys that I worked for was quite liked me and was quite impressed with me, and and we've kept in touch and we're good mates still. But a lot of the people that I worked with would have described me as probably like quite a good bloke, but pretty work shy, which is a pretty fair assessment of me. And I, my motivation some days would be great and other days it would be absolutely terrible. I'm fairly convinced that they kept me on for so long purely because I was helping this other guy build this service line, but also because I was quite good for morale in the sense that I was, got on with everybody and, it was a bit of a laugh and a joke and, and sort of lighten the mood a little bit. But you need to realize that the time will pass whether you put the work in and have a good attitude or whether you don't put the work in and have a stinking attitude. And the trouble is it is very difficult to raise yourself and change yourself and kind of be like, well, they'll be like, oh, so what, just tell me some of the projects that you've achieved in, the 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years that you've been working in your previous role. And if you've just turned up and done the bare minimum, you're not able to kind of go like, oh, I got involved in that and drove that through to completion from start, or I got involved in that, or I built this thing, or, I've built my network, or I've built my presence on social media, or whatever it is. So you need to kind of go, oh, do you know what? It's really hard when you don't like your job or you're finding it difficult in the, in the realms that you're in to keep that positive attitude. But it's so helpful when it does come to actually getting in front of people and to actually being able to kind of go, well, yeah, no, I haven't done anything particular in this area, but look at all these cool things that I did do that show that I'm somebody that's got the right attitude to work. And I think that was something that kind of I found really difficult and didn't realize until like a long time after, really.
Yeah. Well, it's better late than never, right?
Absolutely, mate. Right, absolutely. We live and we learn.
So for anyone who wants to kind of learn more about you then, where are the best places for them to go, Tony?
So LinkedIn is the best place, I guess. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you're more than welcome to. I am pretty active on there and post stuff most days. If anyone's got any kind of specific questions, then feel free to reach out to me and ask me. I've really enjoyed the process of kind of thinking about all this stuff again for this particular podcast. So if anybody, I'm always happy to to give a bit of advice and spare my time for people. So yeah, I know how hard it was. It took me 9 years to make the jump stick. So
All links mentioned throughout this episode can be found in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP71. If you know anyone who would benefit from this episode, please let them know about it. Maybe send them a link to the show notes. That would be greatly appreciated. If you like this episode, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe to sign up for email notifications. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. Hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.